All right, we will get started, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for our final Excellence Ready session, which is all about the sustainable and responsible business practices session. With me, I have Sally Smith, who will shortly present to us on True South. Sally is the project manager for Tourism for Good at the South Australian Tourism Commission. A few housekeeping pieces. Please keep your mics on mute for the duration of the session. There'll be an opportunity for question time at the end. You're also welcome to pop your questions in the chat functionality as well. I'd also like to acknowledge that we're coming to you from the lands of the Kaurna people. I pay my respect to elders past and present, and also pay my respects to the lands in which you're all coming from across the state today. We also like to acknowledge that we are all about creating an accessible and inclusive community, ensuring that everyone has equal access to these sessions as well. So with that, we'll dive right into it. Our agenda for today is quite meaty, as most of our sessions are. First, we'll hear from Sally all about True South and give you an update there, and talk really about how you can weave the True South messaging into your award submission and some things that you should be considering, particularly for the sustainable and responsible tourism section. Then as before, we'll take a deep dive into what this section looks like in the portal, break down those questions, examples and supporting image ideas, and also talk to further nominee support as well, and next steps as per normal. Have you nominated yet? That's a big question. I think everyone here who is live has nominated, but for those who are watching the recording in the future, if you haven't nominated yet, nominations do close tomorrow, Wednesday, 10th June, and are made through the Quality Tourism Framework portal. Highly recommend that you get your nomination in before the close date. If you miss the close date or something happens and you don't get your nomination in, please don't fret. Please don't hesitate to contact me if you are looking to nominate but miss the deadline. That is happy to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. However, if you can nominate before tomorrow, please do so. Once you nominate, you'll be given access to your nominee support kit, so I encourage you to do that before the date closes. And another deadline, because we're all about popping things in at the same time. Tickets for the South Australian Tourism Conference close today. Please, if you haven't already bought your tickets and you'd like to attend, make sure you get in today. The conference is a really great opportunity for learning and networking, but there's a lot that you can take away that will be valuable in your tourism awards submission for different sections of it, but also incredibly valuable to your business. We've got some incredible speakers and panels on both day 1 and day 2, so it's definitely one not to miss. So if you're in Adelaide on the 16th and 17th of June, which is next week, can you believe it? Please make sure that you book your tickets, and I'll circulate a link in the follow-up email post this webinar. As per normal, just a quick reminder of what's involved in your awards submission. As mentioned previously, we're still diving into the written submission, and we're on the last juicy section, which is the responsible and sustainable tourism section. A reminder that the point allocation that's displayed on the screen is not necessarily applicable to all categories. We do have some niche categories where the question sets are a little bit different and the point allocation is different. So please do bear that in mind. So with that, I'm going to shift my screen over to Sally to have a chat to us about True South. If you have any questions, we might at the end of Sally's portion we'll open the floor for questions, but otherwise I'll let her take it away.
Great, thank you, Ella. Thanks for having me. So I'm with the South Australian Tourism Commission and managing a project called Tourism for Good. So really, this may be new to some of you, or some of you may have seen this. At the risk of sending people to sleep, I'm going to talk about a plan, but in this plan is information about tourism as a force for good and True South. So as part of this plan, one of our 3 strategic pillars is tourism as a force for good. Obviously, as well as increasing appeal to drive demand, which is all the marketing side of things that we do. And then on the supply side, the new and evolving products and experiences. But what we want to do is see all of those things through a lens of tourism for good. And I will talk about a bit more about True South in a minute, but just keeping with tourism for good. So really, this section of the Tourism Award submission is really about tourism for good. This is just, like a real emerging movement at the moment around visitors contributing positively to host communities, the environment, and local economies. So for a long time, obviously, we've been talking about the economic impact, positive impact of tourism, but Tourism for Good takes it a little bit further and is looking at, the other benefits, the social benefits and so on, and how we're treating the environment. So Tourism for Good builds on the foundation of regenerative tourism, where visitors leave a destination better than when they arrived. I know, a long time ago, we used to just talk about managing the negative impacts of tourism, and then we moved into really sustainable tourism, where we're looking at the long-term future, and now we're talking more about regenerative tourism. We're actually making things better. So this is about actively repairing, restoring, and enhancing the environment, but also the culture and the communities. And it's, really about that net positive impact. As I said, sustainable tourism we've been talking about for a while, and it's not a right or wrong way. Some people still talk about sustainable tourism, but also include in that the cultural, social, and economic impacts. And some people are talking about regenerative tourism or even using them interchangeably. And I try not to get too hung up about it. The upshot is we're really looking for net positive impact. So how does tourism for good differ then from regenerative tourism? Well, it's really about an overlay of that ethical perspective and reflecting that values-driven and purpose-led approach that drives conscientious travel and social impact. So Tourism for Good emphasises less tangible benefits as well, like increased cross-cultural understanding and human connection to nature. And if you can imagine people who are experiencing nature and perhaps, experiencing off-grid living and that sort of thing, then they can go on to take that back to their own community and take a bit more environmental responsibility. And there's that focus on social equity and well-being of the host community and travellers. And so, we talk about positive impact of tourism, say in economic sense, but that tourism for good angle is not just is there economic impact, but is that economic impact being distributed fairly? Is it spreading to our regions in South Australia, not just Adelaide? And are we, making sure that everyone's benefiting from tourism? So why we're focusing on this, it's a difficult time at the moment. There's lots of issues facing businesses. And it's we understand that, and there's lots of things that we've been trying to do, and TICSA and so on are trying to help with fuel security and all the things that we've been facing. But we do have to bear in mind just that long-term vision, that we need to be meeting the changing consumer expectations. And meeting those expectations will give us the market advantage. So as a state, but also for your business, differentiating differentiating our brand and aligning with those global travel trends, and consumers are looking for, as we know, sustainable tourism and tourism that gives back to the host destination. I don't think, we see what happens in Spain and places around the world where, residents are protesting tourism, and, that's, as a visitor, you would never be wanting to step into an environment, I don't think, where you feel you're contributing to a problem. And likewise, we need to meet the community's expectations. So we have a social licence for tourism, and in South Australia, that's intact. But as I said, in places like Spain, they're losing their social licence. And so we need to make sure that we are creating those positive impacts, and communicating the value of tourism as well. And this is not new, businesses in South Australia are doing this really well. I guess, especially those sorts of businesses that are, submitting tourism award submissions, it's already on your radar, and it's informing a lot of your thinking. So there are some great things already happening. I guess this is just formalising it from our point of view and making sure that, if you are putting, whatever you're putting in this section perhaps does align with what the state's doing. And also I can talk about what Tourism Australia is doing. It just shows the judges that you're you're aligning with, with the state and the national movement on this. So True South is not a marketing campaign. It's not consumer facing. It's just our take on global tourism for good movement. And it's just that guiding vision of how we deliver tourism to make a positive impact on our state, its people, environment, and the economy. And it's not, as I said, one-off. It's just a lens that we're putting over everything that we're doing at SATC. And I know a lot of businesses, are doing this too. True South came about last year. I mean, we're working with TICSA very closely on this, and there was a co-design process to look at what tourism for good could look like in South Australia. And that process involved tourism operators, sustainability experts, accessibility experts, First Nations representatives, lots of partners, tourism operators, to say what would we like tourism to look like in this state, and how can we harness tourism as a force for good. So that group came up with a set of principles, 4 True South principles. So the first is guided by Aboriginal care for place and community. This isn't about Aboriginal tourism as such, but more so just using that traditional wisdom. Aboriginal people have been protecting our environment for many, many generations. And this is about protecting the environment and our culture for future generations. And also the sharing the benefits of tourism with communities across the state. As I said, it's about ensuring that everybody's benefiting from tourism. The second is that it's inspired by regenerative principles. So this is helping to restore, renew and enhance the places and communities that make South Australia unique. To say that we would be regenerative as an industry is quite a stretch, but certainly being inspired by regenerative principles and doing our best to ensure that we are, running our businesses and in our case, our tourism marketing with that lens over everything is really important. And committed to accessibility and inclusion, just ensuring that every person, regardless of their background, ability or identity, can participate and feels genuinely welcome. And that participation is really important. I think we do talk about accessibility and inclusion a lot, but someone just being there is great, and that they can actually get to where they need to be and all that. But if there's ways that they can actively participate and get a lot out of the experience, that's the nuance we're hoping to see as well. The next one is delivered through South Australian hospitality. So hospitality, if you think about it, obviously is different to customer service, which is just a set of procedures that you have in your business. And this is more about how we make people feel. And I know that from Emma Terry's point of view, our chief executive, when she talks about hospitality, having moved here from interstate, just reflecting on the warmth and the generosity and authenticity that South Australians offer, and to create experiences that are welcoming, personalised, and built on meaningful connections with people, culture and nature. I think a lot of people find South Australians do really have that connection with people. We tend to know a lot of people in our community. I know when I have visitors, they're amazed at how many people I bump into in the street and get chatting to people, and I sort of, you can usually make a connection with people. We stop to chat with people we don't know. We say thank you for everything. We really value that human connection in South Australia, and I think that can help differentiate our product. And the connection with nature, even in the city of Adelaide, we have the parklands, but, we are quite an outdoorsy bunch of people, and we really do value that connection that we have with nature. So that's Tourism for Good and True South, which is really just our interpretation of that. So I will just touch really briefly on Tourism Australia. Some of you will have seen their Green is Our Gold framework and program, and they're encouraging operators and all tourism businesses and partners to take the Green and Gold pledge. So perhaps we can follow up and make sure people have that, but that would be a good thing to do. Basically, when you take this pledge, it's really just that you are doing your best to care for the environment and culture, and being accessible and inclusive and welcoming to everyone. And if that resonates with you and you'd like to take that pledge, it doesn't sign you up for anything, it doesn't cost anything. It's just saying that you're on board with that. Then you send that through and it opens up a toolkit. And that is quite a bit different to True South, that our green is our gold. For a lot of it is really about shaping visitor behaviour and helping our visitors behave responsibly when they're here. So there's a set of suggested behaviours that our visitors can show when they're here, and it can range from, they're very specific, ranging from things like bringing keep cups and reusable bags, through to if you're buying Aboriginal art, make sure that it's from a reputable supplier, things like that. So these are shaping visitor behaviour, and the toolkit will help operators to support and reinforce that behaviour when those people are travelling, travelling with you and experiencing your businesses. So to sign up to that doesn't take much, but just familiarise yourself with those principles. They might help guide you when you're answering some of the questions in this section, actually, and give you some ideas. But I think just to be familiar with these principles and what Tourism Australia is doing, you're undoubtedly all doing fantastic things in your own businesses, but to just drop a few little things in there about how you're aligning that, with Green is Our Gold from Tourism Australia and True South, it really demonstrates to the judges that you're up with what's happening in the state at a national level. And, I think that just does add that little bit of professionalism as well.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Sally. With that, does anyone have any questions whilst we're in the True South mindset? Does anyone have any follow-up questions? And you can take the time to think and we can always answer them at the end. But would anyone like to ask any questions of Sally now? You can either pop off of mute or you can pop it in the chat as well. All right, not at this stage. That's okay. If you've got any questions for Sally, we can pop them in the chat and still ask them at the end. Thank you so much, Sally, for talking on True South.
And there will be more coming next week at the
tourism conference. Yes. So if you're attending the tourism conference, stay tuned. You'll get first word on what's going on with True South and what's to come as that project continues to develop and that vision continues to be embedded throughout tourism activity. And I think to Sally's point, a lot of these values, I'm sure, and principles, you already have an element implemented in your business, or they already value highly align with your business values as an operator. So great to consider these as you're writing not only your responsible and sustainable tourism section, but also when you're talking about your business as a whole and your values right at the beginning of your submission. These principles will serve you well and are a great reference point in terms of aligning yourself with SATC and Tourism Australia's vision. And Sally herself has written a few tourism award submissions in her time, so she can highly understand how it's linked.
That's it. And the obviously the regenerative principles and the Aboriginal care for place and community fit here, as do the others as well. But remembering the South Australian hospitality and the accessibility and inclusion is also addressed in the customer service section of the award submission. So there are a couple of places where you can sort of bring it in.
Yeah, exactly. And great to consider as well, I think, some of the language that's used here as well in terms of describing these values. And the South Australian hospitality, that's a great hospitality is a great way to think differently about what customer service looks like in your business beyond the processes and procedures, but what does it actually look like when you welcome someone in. So thank you so much, Sally, and we'll come back to Sally towards the end to answer some questions if anyone has any as well. But what we'll dive into now is looking at the actual section of sustainable and responsible tourism. So just got a layout there of the written submission and how it's divided up. So sustainable and responsible tourism is the fifth and final chunky section. It's worth 20 marks. So not the section that's worth the most marks. However, it's still a really integral part of your submission. It's also the final big section. So it's your last chance to put in any of those examples about your business that you've achieved during the qualifying period. And it's also quite a really valuable section that gives the judges a really good insight into what your activity looks like in this space, where you're at on your journey in terms of sustainable and responsible tourism, and how you're contributing not only from an environmental point of view, but also to society, to community. Ethically, what are you doing? How do you contribute to the local economy? And also, what are you doing culturally? So it's a chunky section with a lot of meat in it. So we're going to try and break it down for you now. But like I said, if you have any questions, just pop them in the chat. Otherwise, we will have question time at the end as well. So before we get into the questions, I just want to talk a little bit about the section that appears in this section before the questions, which is the Responsible Tourism Sustainability Achievements section. So this section asks you a series of yes and no questions. Some of them are automatically filled out based on your accreditation history, but some of them you'll be required to answer. So for this section, there are 3 key elements. So the first is, have you received sustainable tourism accreditation or completed your business standards? Everyone should have done that because you have to complete business standards in order to be eligible. So basically, once you've completed this, it will then tick as a yes for this section. Undertaking an assessment of emissions, and this can either be through the tourism emissions reduction program that we have as part of the quality tourism framework, or an alternative emissions reduction assessment. So what we're asking you here is, have you done any kind of assessment to assess your emissions as a business? If you have, if you've done it through the tourism emissions reduction program, it'll automatically tick as yes. If you haven't done it through that program, but you have done an assessment, and that can be through an external party, it could be through another accreditation program, tick yes to it, but then you'll be required to provide evidence of that alternative assessment. So that could include potentially the report that resulted from the emissions assessment or similar. So please have a think about if you've done an assessment of your emissions, whether that's through the TER program or an alternative one, make sure to reference that here. If you haven't done either, if you're accredited, I highly recommend having a look at the Tourism Emissions Reduction Program. It's a simple 3-stage process that's all about assessing your emissions. It's a self-assessment as well, and you can complete it multiple times too. So it's worth considering not only for the purpose of this award submission, but also just for your business in general, getting an understanding of where you sit in terms of the emissions you produce and how you can look to reduce them. Then we have undertaking an accessibility assessment. So very similar, if you've done the accessible tourism program and you've received a guide, that will be automatically appearing there. If you've done an alternative assessment, please reference that here as well. And again, similarly to that, if you've got an accessibility guide that you had produced or a report that provides an indication of an assessment being completed, that would be great to include here. Again, similarly, if you are accredited and you haven't done either of these things, consider going through the Accessible Tourism Program. It's a self-assessment, takes about 30 to 45 minutes to complete, and at the end you actually get an internal guide to guide your improvements in terms of becoming more accessible and inclusive. So it'll inform you where you're doing really well and perhaps where there are areas that you could improve for the different key accessibility markets. And then you'll receive an external guide as well, which you can then display on your website, which helps educate and inform consumers as to what you're accessible for and what you're not. It's not a bad thing if you're not accessible to things, but what it does tell consumers is what they can expect and what they need to factor in determining how they choose to travel and who they choose to stay with or travel with. The accessibility market really highly value being able to make an informed decision and being given all the information so that they can make the right decision for them and not worry about turning up to a stay or a tour and be concerned about the accessibility of the tour for them and their individual needs as well. And then lastly, there'll just be a question around if you've included an accessible guide on your website. So that can either be the accessible guide that you receive through that program, or if you've got a public facing guide, a lot of businesses do have some access guides that they pop on there. Festivals, you have access guides that you generally have per season, just include it there as well. So with that, that's that first section, which is a yes or no question for you to go through, and that will appear in the portal as well. So with the questions, there's one big question with two parts. So with this question, you're required to provide 2 to 5 examples of practices in responsible and sustainable business that you've undertaken during the qualifying period. These may be new practices or improvements to existing practices. So this doesn't not every practice has to be something you've developed from scratch. It can be something that you've had ongoing for many years, but you're continuously improving it. Only activities and outcomes from the qualifying period should be included though. So qualifying period being the 1st of July 2025 to the 30th of June 2026. So this question's answered in 2 parts. You're asked to provide an overview on your philosophy on responsible and sustainable tourism, and that's a really good section, and we can talk about that momentarily, where you can talk about the True South principles and your alignment to that, and your business values in terms of how you approach being more sustainable and responsible in your activities. Then you're required to provide your top 2 to 5 examples. And then you're also required to provide visual evidence to support your answer. So these are images that you need to provide to support what you've written. They can't be new information. The judges want to see what you've put down in writing. They want to see a visual element of that. So we'll dive more into that in a little bit. So what does this look like in the portal? And I always like to take entrance through what this looks like in the portal, because the last thing you want to do is get to write your whole submission and then you suddenly get into the portal and what you've written doesn't fit how it's meant to be submitted in the portal. So I always like to provide that. So this is an example of what the Responsible Tourism and Sustainability Achievements section looks like. So as I mentioned, there'll be some that are automatically selected based on your history in accreditation, but then there will be some requirements for you to fill out details regarding that alternative emissions reduction assessment or alternative accessibility assessment and the accessible guide. From there, the first question, you'll be able to provide your overview. So that's just in one text box at the very top of the question. And then from there, you'll, much like the previous questions, you'll then have a pro forma, which you're required to fill out. You can add and remove examples. There's little I's to help you as you go. And so basically each example needs to fit in with that pro forma. So you need to answer each pro forma in the order of content that appears in each example. So with that in mind, for this section, because you're required to provide examples that fit into 5 different areas, what you will do is at the start of each example, you'll choose the type of achievement. So that can either be environmental, cultural, social, economic, or ethical. Once you select the type, the pro forma will then populate with the question that's really specific to that type of achievement. So the example on the screen is the environmental achievement. So you can provide an example of how the business minimises its impact on the environment. So that question is in that first text box there is specified to the type of achievement. And then you can go on to provide the outcomes, and we'll break that down a bit further in a minute. And like previous sections, after you've provided your examples, you can then provide your visual evidence by clicking Add Image to add an image. So that's how it appears in the portal. Now, with the portal, I'm going to emphasize it again. If you haven't gone and had a look and you've nominated, I highly recommend you go have a look before you start writing your submission, and have a look as you go, just to make sure that whatever you're writing, because a lot of entrants do choose to write their submission outside of the portal in a Word document. Please just go refer to the portal as regularly as possible, just to make sure that what you're writing in a Word document fits the pro formas and the style that you are required to meet in the portal. You don't want to get to submission day and then what you've written doesn't quite fit how it's meant to appear in the portal. So as I talked about before, and I've kind of already gone into this, is responsible and sustainable tourism achievements. There's some information here on the emissions assessment that's available for accredited businesses, and also the accessibility assessment as well. So I won't go into them in too much detail, but I will circulate these slides after the webinar so you can have a little bit more of a look. If you are curious and you want to be enrolled in these programs, please let me know. I'm happy to provide the next steps to getting you enrolled for accredited businesses. I also just providing some other assessment tools as well. And there's a wide variety that are applicable to businesses in general, but then there's also some that are more tourism specific. And these are some of the other ones that you could, if you have gone through them, great. Or if you haven't gone through anything, you could consider looking at them. So there's some great calculation tools for greenhouse gas protocol, which is similar to the tourism emissions reduction program. So there's some great guidance and also some tools you can use to do a preliminary assessment. It's not quite as thorough as tourism emissions reduction or one that's maybe done by a consultant, but something that you could look at doing if you haven't got anything that you've done so far. And then also, in terms of accessibility assessment, Sparrowly Group, who specialise in accessibility in tourism, have a great self-assessment business checklist. So whilst this is not a third-party assessment, it's a great checklist to see if you are on the right path to becoming a more accessible experience or property or operation. So that's one you can explore. And then ATEC also have an accessible and inclusive host program that they run as well. So if you are familiar with ATEC and you'd like to go through a more export-based program, that's also something that you can explore as well. But there are a number that are not tourism specific available too. All right, so with that, we're going to jump into the actual question. So the very beginning of this question, you're required to provide an overview to start with. So this question in general is all about focusing on your positive impact in 5 key areas, being the key areas that I outlined before. Your brief overview is all about summarizing your overall philosophy. So in this overview, you're providing a summary. You don't want to go into too much exorbitant detail because that's what you'll get to in your examples. But this is where you can really demonstrate what responsible tourism looks like in your business, what it means to your business, and link it to your vision and values as a whole. When you're putting it together, a few things you can consider to help you build your summary is start by pulling together any documents or plans that you may already have in place, or even if you don't have it formally in place, consider how you talk about responsible and sustainable tourism in your business at the moment in terms of how you message it on your website, in promotions, how you message it to contractors, partners, local community. Pull that information together because that will help you build out your summary on your overall philosophy. And so environmental management plan, if you have that formalized, is great, or anything in terms of how you manage activity from a community point of view, a social point of view, an ethical point of view. Pull together any information that may be useful here. Consider how you drive ongoing improvement and action in this space. That's really important. And then how do you communicate your action? So what do you actually tell your key stakeholders about this? Because obviously it's great to be doing this activity. How do you then communicate that to people? Being your consumers, as your primary audience, but also your local suppliers and contractors, your local council, your regional tourism organisation, your local community, the shops down the road from you, things like that. So have a think about the answers to those questions. From there, you'll then need to dive into your examples of your achievements, emphasizing again, these can be new practices that you've implemented, or they can be improvements to existing practices, but only activities and outcomes from the qualifying period should be included. If you want to use comparative data, if it's an existing practice, that's great to do as well, but the activities and outcomes need to be from that 25-26 financial year period. So with this question, because you've got multiple key areas that you can talk about, you could choose to provide multiple examples across all of the key areas, or you could narrow it down to 2 or 3. So you might find that you want to talk really keenly about social, environmental, and community, or you might decide you want to do examples across all of them. You might decide if you've got you've done a lot of activity in the environmental space or the ethical space, you might choose to provide more than one example. It is up to you, but the advice on that would be make sure that you choose examples that are impactful. And also, if you're going to provide 5 examples, consider whether or not you can get enough detail into those 5 examples based on the word count you have available. Sometimes more detail and less examples is better than too many examples and less detail. So it's something to weigh up. So consider that when you're thinking about this question. So the judges here are really looking for the what, why, how, and the impact of each example. So how have you made a positive impact in this space? What did you do to achieve that positive impact? Why did you do it? What was the rationale behind it? And then what were the outcomes? So with each example, there are 5 key areas to choose from. Like I said, you don't have to provide an example for every single area. You might find that you do really well in one area during the qualifying period that you want to emphasize. So with each example, you'll be required to select the key area that this falls in. If it falls into more than one area, choose the best, most relevant area. So cultural responsibility. So this is all about how the business engages with and represents culture. Particularly Aboriginal people. If you engage with any local elders or Aboriginal communities, this is a great one to include here. But also, from a how are you acknowledging Aboriginal land? What little things are incorporated into your business? If there's anything that you've done to progress your engagement there from a cultural point of view, that's great to highlight as an achievement in this section. Environmental responsibility. So this is all about how the business minimizes negative impact and supports positive impact. So this could be through very simple things like the implementation of solar panels, reducing your emissions. It could be more in regenerative environmental projects. You could be looking at more citizen science. It really depends. There's nothing too big or too small in this space. So what I recommend in terms of this answer is consider what big things you're doing and what little things you're doing, because every little bit helps. And how, particularly if you've got any examples from an environmental point of view that you've really embedded in your business and it's become not just something that you do on top of, it's actually part of your daily operations, that's a great thing to include here too. Social responsibility, how the business contributes to or benefits the local community. So this can include simple things like donations, partnerships, can include local work experience or internships. It can include, running events, providing product or experiences for charity organisations, your local sports clubs, things like that. There's a lot that can come under this umbrella. So have a think about what you do, not only regularly, but anything new you've done in this space. Economic responsibility. So this is about how the business maximizes positive economic impact, particularly locally. So if you're in a regional area and you're in a regional town, have a think about how not only do you contribute to the broader visitor economy and the value of that, but how do you contribute to the economy locally? Do you source local products? Do you only procure from local contractors and suppliers? What from your business goes back into the local economy? And then lastly, ethical responsibility. So this is about how you operate morally, fairly, and transparently beyond the legal requirements. And this is a great thing to consider in terms of, particularly if you are in a regional area, particularly if there's wildlife around, how do you manage those types of situations? How do you ensure safe working conditions for all of your guests and all of your staff as well? There's a few things you can address here. So 5 key areas, a lot to consider there, but consider where you are making the strongest impact, particularly from an outcomes perspective for the qualifying period, and that will help guide your answer here. So for each example, you need to make sure to consider the following. So activities, detailing the specific actions that you took during the qualifying period, and then impact. So how has it benefited your business? But more importantly, how has it benefited the broader well-being of your local community, of tourism in South Australia? How has it had a positive impact on the environment? How has it had a positive impact on the economy? Have a think about not only how it's benefited your business, but beyond that, what has it led to? What impression has it left on your guests? Have the guests left feeling more empowered about how they treat, the places that they walk into? Are they going to take any of that back? Sally emphasized a lot of that in through the True South principles, is not only how it benefits the host destination, but what can consumers take back to their own homes to consider implementing and integrating in their community as well. Again, up to you how many examples you'd like to include. You can include examples with large positive impact, or you could consider more smaller initiatives with a cumulative impact. It kind of depends on your business and what your activity has been like during the qualifying period. So with that in mind, I've got a few examples and I won't go into too much detail with them now, but just some things that you can consider in terms of how in some of the different areas that you could consider. So the one we've got on their screen here is around cultural. So this example talks mainly about how they've been driving towards reconciliation with a RAP implementation plan. Now with cultural, you don't necessarily have to have gotten towards a RAP or maybe introducing anything formally. But it could include anything from consultation with the local Aboriginal community, through to formalising it through documentation. But the thing with this response is they've really clearly articulated the things that they've implemented. So cultural awareness training, acknowledgement of country, art partnership, and then also a country walk. So they've really clearly identified what the example is and the activities that contributed to that. And then what the outcomes were. So they talk about strengthened relationships with traditional owners and local Aboriginal communities. And they've also actually included a partner testimonial. So testimonials are really powerful, particularly in this outcomes section. So have a think about for any of your examples if you have testimonials that you can include. Another one for environmental. And keep in mind, these responses here, they're a bit more concise and use up less words. These are probably examples that you provide if you're providing an example for every single key area and you're looking to fill the 5 examples. If you're only looking to provide 2 or 3 examples, more detail will be required, and it's a great way to be able to show the judges the depth of the achievements and how far they've gone. So just keep that in mind that these examples are taking into consideration if you provide an example across all 5 areas, an example for all 5 examples. So just keep that in mind. So for environmental, they've got a 5-year energy reduction plan. So the activities were solar panel installation and motion sensor lighting as part of their 3rd year of this reduction plan. So as you can see, it's an ongoing initiative, but they're talking about how this was implemented during the qualifying period and what that looked like. And then the outcomes, they're talking about daily energy usage from the implementation of the solar panels, their monthly energy cost saving, and their total carbon emissions. So a very data heavy outcome example. So you could look to include here potentially some more examples in terms of the qualitative outcomes. So if this has been communicated to guests in terms of the work they're doing in energy action, you could include testimonials from customers or the messaging that's gone out to customers based on the implementation of this action plan. Now, I did just see a question, so bear with me. I'm just going to see what the question was from Elizabeth. For the responses, do you feel it is more effective to respond in detail to a couple of examples in more depth, or is it better to highlight more examples in a more concise and brief way? Look, Elizabeth, it's completely up to you in terms of how you want to respond to this question. I don't know if Sally has any 2 cents that she'd like to share on it from her awards background, but I think if you've got some really strong examples that have had a lot of activity and a lot of outcomes, there's probably benefit to going into more depth with them. The last thing that you generally want to do is leave the judges wanting more. So sometimes the best way to do that is providing a little bit more detail in an example that has a lot more to talk about than providing another example that perhaps doesn't have as much substance and leaves them wanting more from some of their other examples. But Sally, do you have any?
Well, it's set up a little differently from when I wrote the awards.
Yeah.
There have been some changes, but I think, my temptation is to try and cover off everything. But I would say there were definitely areas, perhaps where we didn't have as much to write about, and perhaps then you focus on those that you can go into a bit more detail, but make sure you cover those other things off in your introduction maybe. So maybe if you decide, okay, we don't have that much to talk about with cultural, cultural benefits then, but if you just kind of weave one sentence in about that to show you haven't forgotten it and you have achieved something or done something interesting that year, you don't have to provide all the information. But I would feel that would sit best with me if I was writing it, that I've kind of covered everything but gone into the detail on the ones that I've really got something worth talking about.
No, that's a great piece of advice, and I think for sure, if there's something that you aren't able to cover because you haven't done much, or you're choosing to spend more time focusing on 2 or 3 key areas and leaving out 2 areas, definitely to cover them off in the summary. That way the judge doesn't say, well, what about this stuff? You didn't tell me anything about what you're doing in these 2 areas. If you've covered it off as a brief summary in the brief summary, you're still addressing it, but what you're emphasizing is, I address all these key areas, but this is where the focus was for the qualifying period, and then you can dive into a bit more depth. So that's a few things to consider, but it's a hard decision, particularly if you have a myriad of examples to include. It's not an easy thing to decide which ones will carry the most weight and substance to them.
The hardest thing I found in this section too was actually measuring the outcomes. I think the economic side of it, I used to, because we were in a region, engage with our local RDA, a Regional Development Australia office, and they were able to take, and local council can sometimes do it too if you contact their tourism person or their economic development person to say, this was our total, these are our basic finances, and they can plug those into certain frameworks to find out what your total impact to the whole region was, taking into account multiplier effect and things like that. So
great.
sometimes it is good to focus on the things where you can actually measure it too. So if it's environmental, like the example there about talking about X% reduction in carbon emissions or whatever, or we were able to say we saved this much water, or we saved this much in energy, or it depends. Sometimes they are nice things that you've done, but they're a bit wishy-washy when you get to the outcomes. So that might be that might help guide you a bit too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with that sentiment in terms of and that might help you determine which ones you go with. If you've got an example that you pop together and you get to the outcomes, and the outcomes that you provide are a bit wishy-washy, that maybe when you consider whether or not there's a stronger example you can provide, or perhaps you choose not to provide that example as a result. Lawrence just provided a question around, would it be better to provide examples across multiple areas rather than doubling up in an area? Look, I think if you can provide multiple examples across multiple areas, that's great, because it shows the breadth of the work that you're doing in the responsible and sustainable tourism space. If you find that, for example, you maybe have one key area where you don't do a lot, but you still want to provide a few examples, you might choose then to provide a double up of an example. But I think it mainly comes down to how much work you've done in those areas. And as long as you address each area in your summary, the judges will want to see the examples that are most robust. So if that means you are doubling up, that might be something you choose to do. Just make sure that you're addressing all 5 key areas in your brief summary at the beginning. That way you're covering all your bases.
And I think if you also, in your philosophy, so say if you in that philosophy, I think it's important to give your why too. Like, are you into these things because it's something that you've seen your customers are expecting, or is it something that you're passionate about because you grew up on a regenerative farm, or I don't know, that you might have a bit of that personal story to bring in. And so if your business is, say if you're a landholder and you might find that there's a lot more scope to do environmental examples, because you're doing tree planting regenerative projects, or citizen science, or whatever, then I think that would make sense that you might choose to do that for 2 of your examples, or you might double up, especially if it relates back to your philosophy, I think.
So I think be guided by how you approach responsible and sustainable tourism in your business in terms of your values. And absolutely, if you're in a situation where you do a lot more work in one area because it's really it's a passion project, it's highly linked to your values and vision and why you exist as a business, highlight those first and foremost, potentially over some of those other key areas where it's not maybe a primary focus. You still might do some stuff in that area, but it's not a key part of your activity in this space. But definitely a hard one to negotiate in terms of what examples do I provide and what ones do I leave out. It's not an easy thing to do with a lower word count as well. And with that, I'll just provide the example of a social or community achievement. So this example is focusing on, it's actually a local youth traineeship and work experience program, partnering with 2 local high schools and a regional TAFE campus. So if you're doing anything with local education providers or state education providers, that's a great thing to include. Could be a social piece, but it also could be a community piece if it's based in your local community in particular. So have some consideration around if there's any activity you're doing, whether people have done work experience, you hire locally if there's a philosophy that you have around, employing locally as a priority. Maybe you provide accommodation to people who, whether it's backpackers or working holiday visas who come and work for you for a season, things like that. So have a think about some of those examples as well. And here, these outcomes are less data driven and they're more focused actually on the qualitative outcome and impact, which, very much is more personal because it's related specifically to people. So they've provided a testimonial and really emphasized what happened to those trainees and students once they completed, their experiences as well. So not all of your outcomes have to be quantitative. If you can provide quantitative outcomes, that's great, but you might find for some of your examples you can't provide that quantitative data, so you have to provide a little bit more qualitative, but make sure that whatever data you're providing that demonstrates those outcomes is still quite robust in that fashion. So obviously there's still two key areas there that haven't been addressed, which is ethical and economic, but there are some examples that you can refer to in your entrance submission toolkit, and obviously happy for you to call and pick your brain as to where different achievements that you've had during the qualifying period sit in terms of your examples. In terms of supporting images, these images are particularly important for some of these examples to bring these written responses to life. Some great image ideas that you can consider is photos of events, partnerships, or certificates. A great way to do that if you've had a thank you from a local community group for donation of time or product, that's a great thing to include. Photos of any waste reduction initiatives or energy reduction initiatives, or any graphs or charts that show reduced usage or a change as a result of an initiative being implemented. Testimonials or customer feedback, as long as it's in the written response, you can include it as an image as well. And it's a great thing to embed on top of images of people actively partaking in the implementation of an initiative, or implementing or taking part in a guest experience that's been impacted by the initiative. And then screenshots of any marketing materials that demonstrate education practices. So this is a great way to illustrate to the judges how you talk about your responsible and sustainable tourism achievements, how you talk about tourism for good within your business. So any marketing materials that you've created, any messaging that you have on your website or in promotions, social media posts, things like that, that's a great thing to include here as well. So with that, that's the responsible and sustainable tourism section. Like I said earlier, a really beefy section, a lot to consider in terms of the many different examples you can provide. So in terms of tackling this section, my first thing would be, there's two things that you should remember. A, take the time to brainstorm and put all of your examples on the table, and then from there choose the examples that have the most robust outcomes or the most to talk about. And then the other thing is to consider as well is make sure that you're not repeating examples that you've already provided in previous sections. There's a lot of overlap sometimes between the business and product development section in particular, the marketing section and the customer service section, because they can overlap into that tourism for good, responsible and sustainable tourism space. So when you're mapping out all of your examples, if you've got an example that actually fits into one of those achievement key areas for the sustainable and responsible tourism section, consider whether or not it's more impactful to include it in business and product development or marketing or customer service, or to actually leave it until the responsible and sustainable tourism section. If you repeat the example, the judges see that as words wasted, and what they want to see is big impact across all areas. So what I would recommend is if you've got an example from the previous sections that actually fits really well into responsible and sustainable tourism achievements, consider whether or not you're better off moving it to that section. If you're going to keep it in the section it's in, don't repeat it in the responsible and sustainable tourism achievements section. So with that, on the screen, I've just got highlighted again the nominee support that's available. Really encourage you to make the most of what's here. If you haven't received your nominee support and you nominated, please let me know. If you haven't nominated yet, you'll get all of this when you nominate. So with that, Are there any remaining questions? And I'm aware that we have gone over time, but does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask or anything they want to pick either my brain or Sally's brain about before we wrap up? And you can either put it in the chat or come off of mute now if you would like. And with no one coming off mute, I'll just wait a moment for anyone in the chat. Oh, we've got one. Oh no, thank you, Elizabeth. So I suppose in terms of some parting words, a big thank you to Sally
Welcome, thank you.
for having for joining us today. It's really great to have her. It's great to have another perspective, and particularly from a state tourism organisation and the principles that are now being introduced. We can't wait to hear further announcements at next week's tourism conference. That will be really exciting. So keep your eye on that because there might be some benefits for you in future in terms of your business, but also from a tourism awards point of view, always thinking about that. If you have any follow-up questions, this is our last Excellence Ready session. So thank you all for joining me over the last couple of weeks. But if you have any further questions about the written submission or any of the sections we discussed, feel free to reach out to me with any questions. Your nominee support kit is there with a lot of resources and examples for you to consider. Otherwise, with that, good luck. Yes. I'll be speaking to all of you individually, I'm sure, but have a lovely afternoon. And yeah, best of luck for a great awards season. Thank you, everyone.